On today's show, we talk to violinist Nicholas Mann, who is the chair of the Manhattan School of Music String Department and Juilliard Faculty member. We talk about the legacy of his late father, four-time Grammy winner and Juilliard String Quartet founder Robert Mann, and his posthumous memoir, A Passionate Journey. Stay tuned, you're listening to The Nikhil Hogan Show. Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone. This is the Nikhil Hogan Show, the premier music interview podcast. And before I introduce our featured guest today, I am delighted to note that we again have the great Christopher Jengolevsky on the show helping me to co-host. Hey Chris, nice of you to be here.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
We have a very special episode today. Our featured guest is going to talk to us about the great violinist and composer Robert Mann, who recently passed away at the age of 97 and was the founder and first violinist of the legendary Juilliard String Quartet. Over a 50-year period, Robert Mann led the Juilliard String Quartet, playing almost 6,000 performances all over the world, scooping up 4 Grammys and sharing their distinctive sound with such notable figures as Glenn Gould, Copland, Leonard Bernstein, and even Albert Einstein. His incredible career is chronicled in A Passionate Journey, a memoir, also written by Robert Mann and available for purchase. A Passionate Journey is a collection of both spoken and written words in the form of essays, letters, lectures, and interviews from various times in his life, offering an engrossing glimpse into a life filled with musical milestones and the mind of a musical giant. We are so thrilled today to be joined by Robert's son, Nicholas Mann, who is here today to talk about the book and his father's life. Nicholas is the founding member of the Mendelssohn String Quartet and co-chair of the Manhattan School of Music String Department and a Juilliard Faculty member. Nicholas, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your father's career is truly astonishing in so many ways, from the high quality of his recorded legacy, which garnered those Grammy Awards, to his 6,000 performances, the famous musicians and figures he's known. With all of that, is it true that he started music relatively late at the age of 9 on the violin?
By today's standard, yes, he was slow to take up the instrument and become serious about a career. It was, even though his parents pushed him, he had other interests as a young boy.
Yeah, he wanted to be a forest ranger.
He loved nature, which played a major role in his life, even in his musical life, so to speak, in terms of how he related to certain kinds of crescendos and decrescendos, thinking of nature as his kind of his inspiration.
For when he started at 9, it mentioned that his teacher he recalled he was an alcoholic, and 2 years later, the teacher was shot and killed.
Yes, you might say. Not your typical story for beginning an instrument.
That's an incredible story. Now, first of all, let me get a couple of technical things out of the way. Did your father have perfect pitch?
He did not. He had very good relative pitch.
Okay. And prior to 9, was he doing anything musical?
Not that I know. Again, his mother, which was probably the reason all the kids in the family, he had a brother and a sister, took up instruments. She was very interested in music and had a good voice and sang in choruses. But no, I don't think he did anything. And remember, he was growing up in Tillamook, Oregon, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere. And in those days, there were really just a couple major musical centers, New York being the center where everyone had to go to study pretty much.
He said here, he's talking about his father, your grandfather. My father knew nothing about music, but he used sense in going to the concertmaster of the Portland Symphony for advice. It was the greatest break of my life. He told my father, your son is no wonderkind, but if he practices hard, he can make a living.
That's correct. Early on, it was obvious that my father was not going to be a famous soloist, but he had other talents in terms of his abilities as a chamber musician, and those shined as soon as he became serious about it.
From 11 to 13, now this is quite a while back, was he a very good practicer? Was he very taken with the instrument, and was he...
No, not at all. He tells the story that he would always... He'd either be reading, he loved science fiction, he'd like open up his music and stick one of his books in the middle and read that, or he'd go out, sneak out fishing. So he tried his best not to practice.
And when he, about 18, right, he went to music school, and eventually transferred over to Juilliard. He was at a different school though before that.
So when it became obvious that he really was interested in a career, his mother, they took the step which was kind of necessary. They knew they had to move from Portland, and they came east to New York. And at that time, there were two schools that inhabited the same building. There was Juilliard, and there was the music of what was it called? Institute of Musical Arts, I believe.
That's a forerunner of the Juilliard School?
Well, they were kind of, I don't quite know the relationship. They kind of shared a building, and they had some of the same teachers, but they were somewhat different entities. And by mistake, he applied to the wrong school. So he got in, and he picked a teacher who happened to teach at both Juilliard and this other school.
Oh, that's going
and
to add to the confusion.
Yes, after the first year, he switched to Juilliard.
Wow. And so could you describe at 18, what was his level like, would you say? I mean, like, how would he have ranked himself as a musician? Like, where was he at musically at 18?
Again, instrumentally, he was probably behind where the major talents were. You know, someone like Isaac Stern was a day younger than him.
Oh, wow.
One day. So someone like that was more accomplished as an instrumentalist. My father, he was a real, even as a young man, very intellectually interested. When he was in Portland, he would go to the the libraries and study the scores of the new composers like Bartok. So musically, he was quite advanced at that stage already. Very, very funny stories. So this is a young boy from the middle of nowhere in New York. His first year, he was kind of overwhelmed by being in a big city, and he didn't practice much his first year in school. And on his first year's jury, one of the teachers wrote, "Never have I seen a talent so deteriorate in 1 year."
If that teacher could have seen his career after that. No, what was his major in college?
Well, again, when you're at Juilliard, you're in a trade school. Even today, you're doing only music, and the only question is what on the violin. Where are you going to be? Are you going to be a soloist? Are you going to be an orchestral player? Are you going to be a chamber musician? So it was all music. That's all you could do.
And so then he went to graduate school after he got his undergraduate. Is that correct? And was he focused on chamber music early on?
Yes, I think very early on he knew his talent. This is a funny thing for me. I don't believe he went to graduate school because he was right then was the war, and he got inducted into the army and had to do a stint in the army before he could start on his career.
It says that in 1946 he joined the Juilliard Faculty after his army service.
So he came back from the army, and at that moment, the president of Juilliard, his name was William Schumann, a very, very famous composer as well. He decided that he wanted to have a resident string quartet. And in those days, there was really no American chamber music world except for the Budapest Quartet, who from Europe, and the Pro Arte Quartet. So no American groups existed. So Schumann decided he wanted to have his own American group, and someone had told him that Robert Mann was a good person to approach about that. And he talked to my father, and my father tried to convince him that he was indeed the right person for this. And there was a famous quote about Schumann says, "Well, why should I choose you over, say, some well-established European group?" And my father said, "Well, because we will try and play the old masters as though they were just written today, and we will try and play new music as though they were the classics that had been performed for hundreds of years." And Schumann liked that quote. And because my father was very into contemporary music, and Schumann was a composer, that was also a big plus for him.
So Juilliard is the incredible world-renowned brand today. What was the school like back then when he was there?
Well, it still was, one of the few schools of music. There was Curtis Institute in Philadelphia, and pretty much Juilliard and Curtis were the only two schools that one would consider. So it was still well known. It may not have had kind of, there were no TV shows based on Juilliard in those days. So I don't think it was known as well by the general public, but it was still, it was the school you had to attend if you were in America.
You mentioned the Budapest String Quartet. What was the scene like at that time? What did your father think of was he listening to records of ensembles from Europe as well?
Oh, sure. And he was going to the concerts. One thing for instance, when you live in Portland and someone famous comes to play, you go to the concerts, because that's it. If you live in New York, you feel great about all of the wealth of music, but sometimes you don't even go to anything because it's overwhelming. But he was very up on, and he was a great admirer of the Budapest, the Perarte, the Polish Quartet. There were a number of really fine European groups that did come and play in the States.
Did that inform his vision and conception for the American string quartet that William Schumann was envisioning?
I think the Polish quartet was kind of his ideal, because they were a quartet that was also very on the forefront of contemporary music. They were Polish was friends with Schoenberg and Webern, and the violist of the quartet, the Polish quartet at a certain point was no longer, but the violist Eugene Lehner became my father's mentor, and so I think that was his model for developing a quartet.
So early on, William Schumann is a famous composer. What other people, when he was a student and also when he was a young professional after the war, for instance, Heifetz was a household name, and were there some of the famous people that he knew at that time?
He did not know Heifetz. Heifetz, first of all, was not at Juilliard. As I mentioned, he did know Isaac Stern quite well. They were friends. People like Alexander Schneider of the Budapest Quartet, he knew those people in the quartet world. And
how about Aaron Copland?
Aaron Copland, not when he was starting out, but eventually, yes, they became good friends. They recorded, they performed together. I think Aaron Copland played on one of their big anniversary concerts with them, like their 25th anniversary concert. Yeah.
And he had worked with Glenn Gould as well?
Glenn Gould, sure. Again, that was a little later in their career. Leonard Bernstein, he knew very well. They worked together. So pretty much at a certain point, the who's who of everyone in music, it's a small world, and he knew pretty much everyone.
What was his relationship with Leonard Bernstein?
Well, again, they were friends. Bernstein did a lot of teaching kinds of television shows and things, of which the Juilliard Quartet was asked to play on a number of them. They actually performed together, and there's a recording of the Juilliard Quartet and Bernstein at the piano. He was a very fine pianist as well. So that was quite a close relationship.
Now, there's also a mention of Albert Einstein, too. Now, how does that factor in?
Well, famous yes, it's a different kind of story, but a very humorous one. So they were playing a concert in the Princeton area, where Einstein lived, and they had been hoping that he was going to come to the concert, but he didn't. And someone, I think it was through Rafe Hillier, whose father was a physicist, they had some connection to something, and so they got invited over to his house, and they brought an extra viola. I think it was Earl Carlos was the violinist, second violinist. So they brought a viola, and they hoping that they could convince Einstein to play with them a viola quintet of Mozart's. And they pushed him, and they met him, and he was deferring, but they kept twisting his arm. So finally he agreed to play the Mozart G minor, beautiful, beautiful piece, viola quintet. So he played second violin, and Earl Carlos, the second violinist of the Juilliard, switched to second viola. And, they were geared in. They watched his every move, for what tempos he would take. And it was very slow. But Einstein didn't even look at the music. He probably knew it all by heart, even though he hadn't played in years. Wow. So they played the whole thing. And they had a great, of course, for them, it was a dream come true. At the end, they said goodbye to him. And
was he a good player?
He was adequate. He was rusty. If you don't practice, no matter how good you are, your chops aren't quite there. But he could play for sure. and he told them how much he loved the experience, and he said, and American groups, I find they play way too fast, but you guys don't play too fast. And of course, inside, because they were accused their whole life of playing too fast, and the only reason they hadn't taken fast tempos was because they were following Einstein. Whatever he wanted, they were going to do. So it was very charming.
Now the quartet is incredibly prestigious, but starting out, your dad mentioned it wasn't very glamorous. Was there like a tremendous amount of like hustle involved in developing it?
Well, first of all, again, there wasn't much of a chamber music scene in America. The audiences were really just the European immigrants who would come over, and earning a living was very difficult. You got paid very small fees, and you had traveling from concert to concert was basically you took trains that whistle stops. Your concert would be over in the middle of the night, and the only way you flag down the train to get to your next place. So it was not a glamorous life, for sure, but it was the life he loved.
When was the point that gigs started to really explode and they were getting booked a lot?
When they first started out, so Juilliard kind of gave them just a couple of concerts, and because of their association with some contemporary composers, they had pieces they could play on specific concerts. But pretty quickly, their reputation grew, so their career became quite impressive pretty quickly. And of course, they latched on. They did a couple things which were big events. Like they were the first quartet in America to play a Bartok cycle. That was a huge event. There were people had played quartets, and there had been in Europe, but Bartok was still considered a very, very daring and unusual composer at that point. And it was a huge concert. Dmitri Shostakovich came to the concert.
Wow.
That's how big it was.
And what year was that?
Ouch. I'm not sure.
Now, I know the quartet won the Grammy for Best Classical Chamber Music Performance in 1965 for the Bartok quartets. Was that a long time before, or was that around the same time?
No, that was their Bartok cycle was way earlier. I think it was in the 50s.
Okay.
Yeah. They did three complete recordings of the Bartoks over his career.
You mentioned your father was very interested in modern music. What made him decide, okay, Bartok, let's go with Bartok to popularize it?
Well, first thing to remember, my father was a very serious composer in his own right. He, over the course of his life, he's composed over 100 works. So the other members of the quartet, many of them were also composers in the early days. So they were, in a sense, more in the tradition of early, in the early days. If you were a violinist, you were like Corelli or Lamon or any of these people, or Gemignani, you also composed too. But being a composer, you have a much greater sensibility for what the process is and an interest in what's being composed around you. Why he latched onto Bartok, I don't know. I mean, they played a lot of contemporary music. Some of it, of names that we still know really well, like the Schoenbergs or de Juilliard, and they played hundreds of works that people will never hear about again. That's very hard to make judgments while you're playing the pieces as to what's going to survive. But I think it was pretty well known that Bartok was someone to be reckoned with, even at that time.
How did they feel about winning the Grammy, your father and the group?
If you go into the bathroom at my parents' house, it's the wall is covered with Grammys and Grammy nominations. I think the only Grammy that meant anything to him, one was they got the Grammy for the Schoenbergs, which he thought was great because Schoenberg is kind of still a disliked composer by the general public. So he's kind of thought, well, if I can get a Grammy for that, that's pretty impressive.
That was 1977, right?
Is it? Yeah, you probably know. I don't. And the other thing is, just a couple of years before he died, he was in his 90s, the quartet receives the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Grammys, which is a big deal. That's more kind of encompassing of your entire career. Grammy, it's such a political thing. I mean, hey, they won a lot of them, so he's not complaining, but it doesn't really mean that much.
Now I want to talk about the group dynamic, and 50 years with, the Beatles didn't last 10. So 50 that's an incredible milestone. And how did your father find the people to join him? And was it his personality that was keeping everyone on the same ship? Did he have a very intense focus? 6,000 performances, everybody's got to be on the same page.
Well, just like a marriage, you're never on the same page the whole time. And if there's any quartet that tells you that it's only happiness and harmony, they're not telling you the truth. There were many membership changes over the course of it was actually 51 years in the quartet. And there were some bumpy moments, some difficult times, and a couple people did leave under duress or unhappiness, but, you're not united by this great passion and love, and you do have to have respect for each other. The problem is you're dealing with personal and musical issues because you're living with these people, 24/7.
Could you elaborate a bit on that, like some of the issues they had, the examples of the bumpiness?
Yeah, well, so they can be anything from just musical decisions, and as you know, in any relationship, whether it's music or not, a lot of the time it's how you say something, or when you say, what are the battles worth fighting for, and it's a learning process. And most people, when they start a quartet, doesn't matter how talented they are as a musician, you got a lot to learn about how to work intensely with three other people. And there could be disagreements about what kind of a schedule you want. Some people want to play 150 concerts, and for other people that's too much, and you've got wives, and you've got so many things, issues of finances, but usually it's a combination of all three that can get very thorny at times.
What did your dad's practice routine look like, both individual and group rehearsal?
Well, he was an early riser, so it wasn't uncommon to wake up and see him practicing at 6 or 7 in the morning a little bit. They had a regular quartet schedule of rehearsals. And when you're on the road, which they were a lot, in those days, again, things were done very differently. Like I remember as a kid, they did 2 huge tours, one in the fall for about a month where they went to Europe, usually in November. And in that month, they would probably play 20, 25 concerts in 30, 35 days. So you can imagine that schedule. And then they would do a huge U.S. tour in January, February, 6-week tour, 6 weeks without being home. No, I can guarantee you there's no group that does that anymore. And in the summer times, we did a lot of traveling as kids with the quartet. They did a lot of summer festivals in everywhere from Europe to Asia, a lot of State Department tours. State Department sent the quartet many, many places. They were the first cultural exchange to Russia. The Russians sent one of their quartets here, and we sent the Juilliard Quartet to Russia. This is in the 60s, really during the Cold War. So as a kid, it was great fun. I got to see so many countries, and everyone had kids. Izzy Cohen had two kids, and Klaus Adam had a daughter who was my sister's age. So it was a lot of fun for us.
Your father has played on many instruments, including ones made by the famous Antonio Stradivarius. What was his main instrument, and could you tell us about his views on different violins?
Well, he played on actually many instruments, but in the major course of his, and when he started the quartets, he didn't have a great instrument. And I'll tell you a very charming story. So this is quite a while ago. There was a man, Robert Lamon. People might know him. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, there's an entire wing devoted to him. He was a huge collector, very wealthy man. And someone at one point told him, you have to own a Strad, just because why not? Someone else told him, well, why don't you talk to Robert Mann, have him shop for one that he thinks is a great instrument, and then you can buy it. So sure enough, my father was asked. He went down to the various dealers and saw gorgeous violins, and he found a Strad he loved. It was called the Rosé Strad, after Arnold Rosé, who was also a very famous quartet player. So he told Lamon, this is the one, if I had the money, I would buy. And sure enough, Lamon bought it. And then a little while later, he got I don't know if it was a letter or a call from Lamon, who said, I've been thinking about this. I know you love this instrument. I'm just a collector. I know how meaningful it is to you, and it isn't really that meaningful to me. So here's my deal, Lamon said. If you can raise and find the money that I spent for it, not a penny more, just the amount I spent, at any point, I'll sell it back to you. It's quite a wonderful, thing. Things don't usually happen that way anymore. So sure enough, my father began the task of raising money from his parents, from everyone he knew. And in those days, Stradivariuses didn't cost as much.
How much money are we talking here?
This was, I believe, $30,000.
It's like in the millions now, right?
Yeah. Now it's very hard for musicians to buy them.
How many Stradivarius violins are there in the world?
It is believed that Strad made around 2,000 instruments. He lived a long life, also into his late 90s, but there are only 500 that are either in playable or in circulation. So that's a small number.
What does he think about different violins? He's played a lot of instruments. Does he have if he picked up a cheap one, would he be upset?
No, in fact, he bought a couple modern instruments and played concerts on them. A great instrument has a soul that's very special. Every instrument is different. It needs to be played differently, and it responds differently. And in the course of his life, he played three different Stradivariuses. So he was very lucky.
I've read that the Juilliard String Quartet was the favorite ensemble of composer Elliott Carter. Could you describe your father's relationship with Elliott Carter?
Yes. Elliott Carter, who he lived to about 103, was truly one of the great American composers. And early on, they were drawn to his music. I think it was Juilliard, or I'm not sure who did it, but they played the first performance of the second quartet of Elliott Carter's, which won the Pulitzer Prize. And from that point on, they became closely associated with him. Carter wrote his third quartet for them, and they became close friends. Carter wrote a solo piece called Rhapsody for my father's 80th birthday. And so there was a great admiration between the two of them for each other.
It says here that your father said, we didn't want to have smooth chamber music in a 1997 interview. If Bartok wrote ruvido, rough, we wanted to sound ruvido. And that, some people have talked about that as a defining characteristic of the quartet. Could you comment on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, there was no question when they started out. They had an amazing amount of energy, which everyone kind of was in awe of, but a lot of people criticized them. They thought that they were too wild, too rough. There was a more European, slightly more rounded edges, and where beauty was kind of always the central issue. And my father always said, yes, beauty is great, but there are other things besides beauty. So I think the quartet became famous for kind of a dramatic strength they had. They had a rhythmic incisiveness, and certainly they had an intensity which few quartets could equal. And in Beethoven, some people still criticized it because they believed in the metronome marks of Beethoven, which were a lot of them were very fast. But it was shocking and great and inspiring, and depending on your viewpoint, but it was quite amazing. When
they were looking at the pieces like the late string quartets, and how much of did they want to be exact with what was on the score, and how much was their own personality, do you feel?
Well, you can do both. They were at a time when urtext, which is, for those who don't know, urtext is the idea of trying to find actually what the composer wrote. So when, for instance, when Casals played the Bach suites for solo cello, and they're great recordings, he didn't even have access to the original things. They were very edited, and so phrase markings and bowings were all different. So Juilliards were on the forefront of saying, hey, let's see exactly what the composer wrote. But my father, he didn't stop there. Again, being a composer, you realize that there's a real circle, and composers do change things and make adjustments depending on the performer. So it's the starting point. You must have the composer's vision always in the forefront, but certain things can be changed. It's not, back in the days of Baroque and classical, I think they were a lot freer than we are today.
Some listeners might have watched a movie made in 2012 called A Late Quartet, which is a very interesting movie that follows the life of an established string quartet coming on close to 25 years. Did your father watch the movie? And if so, what did he think? Also, if a movie were made about the Juilliard String Quartet, how would that look?
I don't think he saw that movie. I think that came out. He was not a big television person. He loved science fiction, and he loved James Bond kind of movies once in a while. But I don't think he saw the other movie. I don't know, a movie on the Juilliard Quartet. Well, the very wonderful director Alan Miller did do he did one.
All right, the Speak the Music, is that?
That's more specifically about my father, but obviously anything about my father deals a lot with the Juilliard Quartet. And he also did a short movie called Bowing Out, which was all about my father's, basically his last concert when he left the quartet. But who knows? A quartet about the Juilliards. Well, it would have lots of intrigue and excitement.
They might have to sensationalize a few elements.
There you go.
Well, now, Nicholas, was your father interested in reading composers' letters and biographies to get insights on performance style?
Without question, he was extremely well read. I think of him as a Renaissance man in music. Which we don't see that much anymore, because of his, first of all, his interest in composing, but he was interested in so many things. He was reading Shakespeare. He was studying how to do Baroque ornamentation. Everything. He was a sieve, a sponge in terms of soaking up everything that he could find. Yeah, very knowledgeable.
In 2014, during a commencement address, he said, you actually were giving the commencement. You talked about your father. You said, he strived to stay an amateur, but not an amateur in today's pejorative connotation, but in its true meaning, amour, to love, to do it for the music. And it really seems like love bursts out of him. He's so passionate. And I really want the audience to understand that just watching any video of him, he's alert all the time, excited. Doesn't seem like a moment where he's off. He's always on.
That 100, you're correct. First of all, as a performer, even in rehearsal, I swear there was never a single note that he ever played where he wasn't giving his all and care and love to everything he was doing. Most of us have our moments where we're in and out. Not him. He was totally there all the time when it came to the music. And pretty much anything in his life. Passion is certainly, when anyone talks about him, it's a word that's easily used. It's probably overused a lot in today's world, but for him, it really works. Yeah, he was passionate about everything that he did.
Actually, to go back to Elliott Carter, could you talk about this anecdote? Is it true that the group once devoted 2 full rehearsals to a single measure from Elliott Carter's Third String Quartet?
That is correct. he wrote the third string quartet for the Juilliards, and it was kind of a groundbreaking idea. He broke the quartet. Carter broke the quartet into two duos, a violin and viola and a violin and cello. And they each played at different tempos. They had even a different number of movements within the piece. And on top of these different tempos, the most complicated, difficult rhythms. It took them just to figure out, get an understanding of how to put together one bar took them, an entire rehearsal. Today, again, as everything goes, groups can learn it faster now because they're more used to that language. Just the way Bartok, when it was first written, took hundreds of hours, and now you can watch a young group learn it in a week. That's just the way things go. That's progress, I guess.
Now, your father was a very prolific and experienced composer. I want to get your take on classical improvisation. Is that something that your dad's ever talked about, improvisation? Because I do know that Baroque ensembles used to improvise quite a bit. What did your dad think about classical improvisation?
Well, he would have been all in favor of it. Within the confines of playing a Beethoven quartet or other thing, there's a limited amount of improvisation you can do. He did, certainly when he played Baroque music or stuff, he did do ornamentation. There's also improvisation of just the momentary phrasing of how you react to each other, of which he was a master of that. He made all his students, and including himself, he wrote his own cadenzas. For if he was playing a Mozart concerto, he would play his own cadenzas. So that's close to improvisation. It's not quite there, but yes, he would have been fully supportive of learning how to adjust the musical phrasing to the moment.
Let's talk about your dad as a teacher now. Did you ever take lessons with your father?
I started the violin. I also started late with him as my teacher. And pretty early on, we decided it wasn't a great idea because he was, as I mentioned, on tour a lot, and I didn't want to practice. And he being a teacher, he saw so many stage parents, and both him and my mother didn't want to be stage parents. So at a certain point, we decided I needed someone else to be the weekly teacher, even though he was always my mentor. But my father, he was just as passionate about teaching as he was about performing. And he is really responsible for changing the entire landscape of the young quartets. It's a who's who. Whoever you mention, he taught them, basically, whether it was the Emerson, Tokyo Quartet, they all came to him, and he was an inspiring teacher. As a performer playing in my quartet, I can honestly say there wasn't probably a single concert where I never played, and at backstage after the concert, someone would come back and say, "Are you related to Robert Mann?" and then they would, as I've said in other situations, they would, as I said, yes, I'm his son. Their eyes would light up, and they would start telling me stories of, I studied with him here, or I went to this concert, or I have their recordings. And it was obvious that he had a pivotal connection to their love of music, and he's touched a lot of people. His DNA is woven deeply in the fabric of chamber music.
Could you speak about his teaching philosophy, like when he was your mentor, or when he was able to be your mentor and he wasn't touring, and when he was teaching these other young musicians?
That's, it's hard. He didn't have a method, First of all, it was always related to the student. It certainly was inspiring, but, it was, I don't know how to describe. He was honest. Sometimes he was brutally honest, but at the same time, the students knew that he had this love for them, so they could accept his honesty, because he would then rebuild and help them, with the support. it's hard to describe, when you're dealing in any field with great teaching, well, what it is. But it was certainly, if you went from one lesson to the other, you wouldn't hear the same things being said once after again and again.
Do you adopt any of that in your own teaching method with your students?
I certainly try to, and I know so many people I know, tell me that he's in forefront of their mind when they're talking to the students, from things they remember that he told them. So yeah, you carry a lot. You hope to, and I think I do a pretty good job. But
the book is A Passionate Journey, a memoir, and it's available for purchase. All right, hot seat time. Are you ready?
Sure.
All right, here we go. Who were your father's top 3 composers and why?
Well, yeah, that's really tough. That's like the desert island. What would you bring? Let's stick to the chamber music world, which would, because that would exclude like Bach and other people of the composers he played. Certainly Beethoven would have to be high on the list. That would be like the Himalayan mountain range. He loved Haydn, but yeah, again, if you told him 3, he would be very disappointed that those are small. It's like a meal. You want variety too. I mean, even your favorite dish gets a little tiring if you can't change it up every now and then. That's one of the great things about being in the quartet world. The wealth of music is just phenomenal.
What about your father's favorite violinists?
Okay, well, of the old school violinists, one of the top people was Joseph Szigeti, the Hungarian violinist, who was also very close to Bartok. I think that would be high on his list of great players.
Why did he like him so much?
Again, Szigeti was he was a great musician. He wasn't the violinist that Heifetz was, but he had a deep understanding of music and had a real soul. But he loved a lot of artists. He very much admired Isaac Stern. He loved Chrysler. There were a lot of people to admire, that's for sure.
Now, the Juilliard String Quartets released quite a number of albums. What were your father's personal favorites? When
I think if you talk to any musician about their recordings, they don't really want to talk about them. It's like I play a concert and then you go to the reception afterwards and they start playing your recording because they think they're being nice and you can't stand it. It's like it's a frozen moment in time. And you leave it behind, and you don't really want to hear it again because you're on to something new. I don't think he would know what was his favorite. I mean, obviously, recording the early Bartoks recording was very important to their career, and sure, some of the Beethoven recordings important, but he never listened to any of his own recordings, so I don't know if he would know.
You mentioned that your dad loved to read. Who were his favorite authors?
Wow. Well, just to show you what kind of a mind he had, he read Finnegan's Wake, and that was an important book to him. I can't even get through several pages of it. It's so complicated. But he was just extremely well read. He, from the most serious, whether it's Shakespeare, and as I said, he had this incredible love of science fiction. He literally read every single book that there was, good and bad science fiction. So, yeah, a great variety.
Now, for people interested in your dad's compositions, can you recommend a few of his works for new listeners?
Let's see. Well, one of the interesting things he did is my mother studied to be an actress. And once he learned that, he started doing a lot of composition for narrator. And he took a lot of the Gesso stories, Kipling Gesso stories, and Hans Christian Andersen folk stories, and put them to music. And so some of them are a lot of fun. They're both fun for kids and for adults. But he wrote a lot of serious. In fact, he wrote a piece for Metropolis and the New York Philharmonic, which I can tell you, for those who are hearing this conversation of ours, it's going to be reperformed by the American Symphony Orchestra on January 25th in Carnegie Hall this year. So, He wrote a piece that Itzhak Perlman for violin and piano, but that's published. A lot of the works are not published yet, and that's one of my jobs as I go through all of his stuff, is I want to get more and more available to the general public.
Can you list any other styles of music that your father was interested in?
He had a great love of, like Bartok, of folk music. And in fact, he traveled around the world and collected. We have a huge collection of instruments from around the world. So he whether listening to gamelan or orchestras of Asia or jazz, pretty much everything except really popular modern music. I don't think he listened to rap or but yeah, he loved music he loved the gypsy, the Hungarian gypsy violinists. Yeah, he was very interested in all the different cultural music.
Now, did your dad play other instruments apart from the violin? Like when he was composing, did he use piano? Did he use any other instruments?
Yeah, I wouldn't say he was a good pianist, but he could get around the piano. He definitely composed at the piano a lot. He was a very fine violist. I think that was it. I do know as a young kid back to Portland, they had a quartet competition every year, and one year they lost their only cellist in the school, so he picked up the cello for a year. And then they came in third, but of course there were only 3 groups in the competition. So yeah, I think violin was really the major instrument for him.
As he got older, he didn't seem to slow down. What did he get excited about for future projects, for like growing his group and compositions and playing?
Well, yeah, you're right. Up until he had a stroke in his mid-90s. I was on a tour with him playing concerts. We played in Houston and LA, and he was sounding fabulous. Usually at that age, your sound begins to have problems, but he was sounding gorgeous, and the stroke slowed him down. He had to stop playing, but he was still composing. He was still teaching. He was one of those that didn't believe in spare time.
What was it like playing with your dad, though, touring with him?
Yeah, it was quite a wonderful experience. It's hard to describe, but it made for our relationship. It was very deep because it both had a musical and a personal aspect to it. And certainly people who watched, they could pick up on that. They always would come back and say, wow, you're so lucky. And indeed, I was lucky.
I'm sure he must have had a lot of students who, with their own string quartets and ensembles, come to him for advice. What's the most common advice he'd give to young players? I think the main thing had to do with being sure that you truly loved and were passionate about what you were doing, and then the career will follow from that instead of thinking career first. You have to have the underpinning of the real love of what you're doing, and then it's a great career, no matter where you end up. He always said, he'd be just as happy if he was in a quartet in Albuquerque as he was in the Juilliard Quartet, as long as he was playing the music he loved. What were your dad's proudest musical moments?
I don't know. It's a continuum, and there were so many of them. I'm not sure he thought in those terms. It was just the continuous, ongoing thing. You either keep going. If you start getting too involved in what was good and what was bad, and gee, this was my great moment, I don't know. I think it stops your progression. I think all great artists just go forward and don't look back much, And he definitely was looking forward to the next concert, the next piece he would write, the next mountain climbing trip we took. He loved nature, so yeah.
What are some young players that your dad was enthusiastic about?
Well, there's so many, but currently playing, he loved working with Mark Steinberg, who's now first violinist of the Brentano Quartet, or Jeff Nuttall, who's the first violinist of the St. Lawrence Quartet. He was very close to Mark Sokol, who was the first violinist of the Concord Quartet. but the list could go on and on. I mean, it's a who's who of people who worked with him.
Can you name some of your dad's favorite venues to play or favorite countries to perform in?
Sure. Well, they had an association with the Library of Congress, which has one of the great chamber music halls in America. There aren't that many great halls in America for small halls, and that is truly one of the great ones. And they played there for, I don't know, about 30 years as the resident group. And so I think that would certainly be considered one of the great venues. And in Europe, playing in places like the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. But anywhere that that the audiences are great. I remember them. I was on one of their trips to Russia and the clapping and the playing 12 encores because they wouldn't stop. So you as a performer, you sense the audience. So if the audience is with you, that becomes a great concert hall, even if it's not the greatest acoustics.
Did your dad ever visit Asia, Singapore?
Yes, without question. He would a lot of trips to all over Asia. Whether it was, he didn't do actually the quartet. Never went to China, although he did on his own. But it was kind of China opened up to performance after the Juilliard Quartet was no longer part of his life. But definitely he was in Singapore, Philippines, all over.
The book is a passionate journey, a memoir. How long did it take for your dad to write the book? And it actually is a collection, right, of things.
He had this idea of writing a book, but it wasn't a top priority. So he would write a chapter or so, and then he would think that it wasn't good or whatever, so he put it away. So after he was still alive, but he was after his stroke, and he was really not able to do that much. We took it upon ourselves to feel that it was important to get something out there for the public to refer to get a sense of him. So we started with the few chapters he actually wrote for the book, but then we had a huge wealth of interviews he had done. So those were transcribed and we picked and chose from them. There were a bunch of letters he had written. He gave a lot of phenomenal lectures at various places, so we included a couple of those. So it was really a potpourri of things, but it was all his writing. But he was not the one that actually put the book together.
It's an amazing career, really fantastic. Nicholas, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate you coming to talk to us. Would you like to mention any projects? You mentioned one just now, but is there any more you'd like for people to check out?
No, although what will be very soon, we're launching a website on my father, which will have a lot of information. And actually, we will start to be putting some of the music as well for people to download. So it'll be robertmannviolinist.com. I don't think it's actually up and working quite yet, but it will be very shortly. And so that would be a place for people to find out more information. And certainly the movie Speak the Music, which is available on Amazon or anywhere else, is a wonderful way of getting a personal sense of who my father was.
Well, let's end on this final question. What advice would you give to any young musicians, whether it be in a quartet or just any style of music, any instrument? What would your advice be with all the knowledge you have, not just from your father, but your own experience?
Well, I would say learn from the great masters that came before you, one of which was my father. As I think Einstein was the famous one who said, I stand on the shoulders of others. Well, that's true as an artist, and you need to be aware of all the great people who went before you, and my father was truly one of those.
Passionate Journey, a memoir by Robert Mann, 6,000 performances, 50 years at the top level, 4 Grammys. It's an amazing book. Nicholas, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. Wonderful to talk to you both.
Thank you so much for listening to our interview with Nicholas Mann, a very fine, accomplished musician and articulate spokesperson for his father's legacy. If you enjoyed the interview, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, and share the show with your friends and family. Thank you again, and I'll see you at the next show.